Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of season 6 of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks Project Manager. And as you'll know, the theme of this season is At Home, the Green Remains, which is also the title of a John Figueroa poem. In At Home, the Green Remains, we've been looking at the connection between Caribbean writers of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, their relationship to the natural environment of the Caribbean and beyond. We're very excited for today's guest, Puerto Rican poet Ana Portnoy Brimmer, who joins us actually to celebrate the forthcoming release of her debut collection of poems, To Love an Island. The English release date for To Love an Island is December 7th, and it will be published by YesYes Books, with a Spanish language edition forthcoming from La Impresora in 2022. Ana will be interviewed by our very own Andre Bagoo, award-winning poet and journalist. He has a collection of short fiction coming out next year from People Tree Press, and as you know, his collection of essays, The Undiscovered Country, was the winner of this year's OCM Bocas Nonfiction Prize. I know they're going to have a scintillating and deep conversation together. Please join in with your comments and questions and participate in the live. I really hope you've been enjoying the season of Bios and Bookmarks so far. And if, of course, you have been a friend and a fan of all we do here at the Bocas Lit Fest across our history, please consider becoming a friend of Bocas Lit Fest to further support all our initiatives into 2022 and beyond. You'll see more information about Friends of Bocas Lit Fest following this episode. Thank you, everyone, and please enjoy the conversation and readings.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Shivani. I'm really happy to be back as a guest host for this season, the theme of which, as Shivani mentioned, is At Home, the Green Remains. Thus far, we've seen some really amazing episodes featuring novelist Barbara Lala and poet Jason Allen Paysan. Our guest today is poet Ana Portnoy Brimmer. Ana is a poet and organizer who was born in New York to Mexican Jewish parents, but raised in Puerto Rico, where she's joining us from today. Portnoy holds a BA and an MA from the University of Puerto Rico and is an alumna of the MFA program in creative writing at Rutgers, as well as an alumna of the MoCo Writing Workshop. She's the winner of the 92Y Discovery Poetry Contest 2020, and her debut collection, To Love an Island, is due next month from YesYes Books, and this is something of her Caribbean debut, so to speak. To Love an Island has already been described by our very own Shivani Ramlochan as an act of remarkable witness. Richard Georges says the book is full of melancholy and magic, rage and wonder, while Willie Perdomo declares these poems as poems produced by the quintessential warrior poet, decolonized, fearless, speaking truth to oppression, and making room for the heart to come out of its shadow and sing. For my part, I see this book as one concerned with liminal spaces, both in terms of time and place. In these pages, the poet returns us to specific historical moments, such as the Ricky Renuncia movement, hurricanes, and blackouts in Puerto Rico, but we are asked to consider what happens when the cameras go and the media coverage ends. What happens in the spaces and moments not covered by the official record? The moments when we are tempted to ask, what now? What next? And just as this is a book concerned with the moments in between, so too is it concerned with liminal spaces. Where is home for someone journeying away from Puerto Rico, then back again, and away again, and back again? What is home when all of us are, to paraphrase a famous poet, always somewhere else? I'm really looking forward to this reading and discussion. So, welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a humbling and rich introduction.
So before we get into questions, I would ask you to, can you share a few of your poems for us?
Absolutely. Thank you for the invite. I'm going to be reading from my book, To Love an Island. I'm going to stick to the 10 minutes and I'm going to start with a poem entitled Strawberries. I'd always been told strawberries couldn't grow in Puerto Rico. We didn't have the climate. Up here, on this finca, past the carcass of Peñuelas' petroleum past, where even the hummingbirds are dizzy with height, small strawberry studs slip off like beads from a necklace on my tongue. The farmer picks them gently from their fuzzy casing, warm and tender from swallowing the world's beatings, as he shows us his budding coffee crop. Crecemos el café bajo sombra. I think of all the work we do in the shadows. Rearing coffee under the sun is hurried and stifles taste. Its flavor should be layered like the rock that makes this mountain of an island. All plants are carbon husked patients, but coffee is a slow birth, bean of push that can take as long as 4 years to ripen. Intercropped with bananas, papayas, and pyrethrum to lure away pests, allow for just and solidary growth and abundant existence. This steep hill of harvest is everything we're slowly trying to become. The farmer says after the hurricane, they lost the majority of their coffee shrubs. Seeds were swept away with all else. Mass growers strike deals and offer seeds so local farmers can grow to sell back to them. We have to grow our own to be our own. He smiles, splits open a coffee pod, drops the pulpy body in my hand, and tells me to try it. I'd always been told freedom would never come for Puerto Rico. We didn't have the climate. I asked the farmer about the strawberries. Son silvestres, he responds and points to their beautiful excess. I'm gonna read two more poems. The next one that I'll be reading is a sonnet. Let me find it here on the page. And it's called The Governor and the Cock. And just some quick context for this poem is that in 2018, Puerto Rico experienced a record-breaking number of femicides, among other variations of gender violence, and spearheaded by this feminist collective, La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción en Puerto Rico. They demanded the governor of Puerto Rico to sign an executive order and declare a state of emergency in response to this epidemic of gender violence in Puerto Rico. And the governor ignored and repressed their claims. But a few weeks later, after the US Congress resumed the conversation on prohibiting cockfights in Puerto Rico, the governor immediately retaliated, defending and lobbying to continue this practice in the archipelago. And so the ironies of the whole situation sort of laid themselves on the ground for me, and I wrote this poem. So, The Governor and the Cock. A cis man is willing to go through hardest of lengths for his cock. The governor is no different. 24 women are dumped at the lip of some stream, a shaft of bridge. Feminists claw blood from police altars and sleep on cobblestone. The government whips out its ranks and sprays red thins to river. He won't sign their executive order. A hand comes down, marble fisted on spurred island cocks. Trainers unzip their mouths, haul out their cages. A state of emergency is declared. He will fight to protect their cocks. Bush born and reared on stroke, their right to brawl is learned. Blows, an act of cultural preservation, jabbing, an inherited sports, a cock's training. He will defend the safety of their violence, plumed quarrels and thrusts erect to kill. Why change history now? This animal given nothing to peck but power, and power goes straight to the head. But the head knows as the cock crows and morning is forced out of bed, that the pit will erode to ruin the chopping block in its stead. And then I will finish this reading with a poem entitled Educación. And this poem is inspired by and in conversation with a dear friend, poet, and comrade called Larco Mura. Educación. Always swim towards an oncoming wave, then dive. Never swim against the current. Let it hurl you out to sea, then wade back ashore. The shore is lined with sargassum and sea grape, not littered. Don't litter the sand that straddles a leatherback's young. Leatherbacks leave for ocean and migrate years before returning. Returning will die on the airport runway, buried inside your ribcage. Your ribcage will resprout with return through graveyard soil. Keep mice away from the soil you pile into pots of ají and white oregano. A good pot of white rice colors your lips with oil. Pour oil into the pot to pave it with pegao. Don't throw away pegao, the scraping hides resistance. Cats will hide hours before a hurricane. The eye of a hurricane opens the eyes of a people. The eyes of a people can grow clouded with Saharan dust. Saharan dust crosses the Atlantic, storms through windows of foreclosed homes. To occupy a foreclosed building is to step on a police anthill. The police will tear gas you because you fight for education. The police will tear gas you because you fight. The police will tear gas you. Tear gas washes off with vegetable oil, water, and palmolive. Watch water at your ankles. It could be raining upriver. El río Guanajibo, el río Mameyes will bathe you when your pipes and faucet parch. When you're parched for days end, have a medalla. A medalla won't raise your salary or free Puerto Rico, but tonight it'll do. Tonight, listen for the strange music of sirens and chicharras. Tonight, imagine sirens lure to shipwreck away from your archipelago. Tonight, let news of your archipelago watch itself. Instead, watch for Dominicana and the Virgin Islands watching you, just as eager for your hand. Tonight, when the power goes out, give your neighbor a hand, connect them to your generator. Tonight, connect last year's Christmas lights and count all the burnt out bulbs. Tonight, from New Jersey, count the days till you come back home. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that reading, Anna. It's really wonderful to hear you, give voice to these poems, which I've been spending time with on the page. And that actually leads me to my first question. I've been thinking a lot about something J.H. Prynne once said, and He once said poets don't simply write down language as spoken. We write with something he calls mental airs,
Mm.
where what is written on the page is this type of sublectical thing in between language. And I was just wondering for you, what is your process like in approaching, these poems and in approaching reading them? Some of these poems obviously have Spanish elements, some have some really wicked puns. What is your process like in bringing them to life and preparing to read, and perhaps even in the composition moment?
Mm. It's interesting that you bring up this aspect of speaking poems into existence or doing performances, because we're almost 2 years into a global pandemic, which, among many more pressing things, of course, but it has complicated and shifted the ways we gather around poetry and poetry performance more specifically. So the few poetry readings I've done over the span of these 2 years have been over Zoom, and I have to tell you that the Zoom enforced removal of the self from the immediacy and intimacy of a poetry reading or any kind of communal gathering makes it really difficult to enter any kind of performance state of mind, which is ultimately, again, reliant on collective experience, right? So
Yeah.
the first in-person poetry reading I did was about a month ago in New York, and it was a shock given the intense exposure I was all of a sudden flooded by. But it was also a beautiful rush because to be in a space where people were intentionally gathered around poetry and dedicating a part of their day to listening and communally partaking of the ritual of poetry was magical. So for me, preparing to read a poem more recently has actually more so involved sitting down with myself to interrogate and find the ways to break through the crippling anxiety that pandemic isolation and exacerbated mental illness have propitiated when it comes to performing. And also, I think practicing a lot, doing a lot of, I think, oiling of the motors, because right now I actually feel very out of tune with my performance self.
Oh no, but it didn't show. And one thing I wanted to ask about is, that you mentioned performing for an audience and presumably an English speaking audience. And a lot of the poems in this book are multi-layered and engage with Spanish, obviously. And a lot of the epigraphs, some of them are in Spanish, some of them are translated, some are not. And I was wondering, how are epigraphs functioning in this book? And can you tell us about the main epigraphs that you have at the very beginning of this book?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Thank you for taking note of that. While I was in my MFA program, people were always pointing them out in my work and having debates about them. But for the purposes of my book, firstly, I think epigraphs were a docu-poetic feat, an attempt at directly engaging with and or questioning primary sources to do the work of archival and documentation via poetry in a way. I was collecting news articles, interviews, and building off of them or problematizing them. And this effort involved either attempts at rescue, because primary sources documenting that moment in our collective history were scarce, or attempts at interrogation, because primary sources are also so often complicit and aligned with the narrative and discourse of empire. So that was definitely going on with the use of epigraphs. And I would also say an open attempt at conversing with and paying homage to the poets who were speaking to me at the time, or who it felt like they were whispering in my ear, and whose own work was fueling and feeding my own. And the initial epigraphs that I have in the book, you mean the opening ones that frame the entire book itself?
Yes.
Yeah, so the first epigraph by Mahmoud Darwish and translated by Mohammed Shaheen, uh, I mean, it's in there for multiple reasons. No, I mean, the sentiments of the stanza itself, I feel, reverberate throughout the book, but also this attempt at drawing decolonial, transnational
Would you
link.
read them? Would you read those epigraphs for us?
Absolutely. Yes, yes. So the epigraph by Mahmoud Darwish is: My homeland, the iron of my chains is teaching me the vulture's violence and the optimist's fragility. I did not know that beneath our skin is the birth of a storm. Oof, which I just, that one, it's a killer. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful stanza. But so, yeah, also this attempt at drawing these decolonial, transnational parallels and
Yeah.
links between these occupied spaces with similar or just tangential historical struggles. The other one is an epigraph by Raquel Salas Rivera, a Puerto Rican poet, and it reads, y en todos somos independientes, hasta en el hueco más colonizado del temor poroso, hasta en la panadería más llena de periódicos de anuncios, hasta en el acto corrosivo de decir que somos isla solamente. And then the last one is Somos más y no tenemos miedo. And that's actually a protest chant or refrain. And it picked up a lot of momentum during the Riqui Renuncia movement. And it felt like a collective voice of Puerto Rico at that moment. And it felt kind of important to have that framing.
Is it roughly translated? We're all together, not afraid.
Roughly, there's a lot of us and we're not
There's
afraid. There's more of us.
yeah,
There's more of us and we're not afraid.
afraid. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I mean that as well. I noted was a key feature of the writing in that it asks us to come to terms with Spanish as a language unapologetically. It's not always translating it. It's saying, I don't know if you meant to challenge this idea of an anglophone kind of dominance within letters. If was that part of your thinking?
I think, and more so ever since, because I lived in the States for 2 years, I was doing an MFA program there. And I think that aspect, of the impulse to do that came to the fore when I was in a space where English was at the center of all of it. But I think also it was more instinctual just because Spanish is the language that I speak on the daily. It's my quotidian register. And it's a whole thing because then people also ask me, well, why are you writing in English? And that's a whole conversation to be had, right? Also about maybe where I was born and the levels of privilege I had access to here in Puerto Rico as well, private schools, stuff like that, right? But because Spanish is the language that I use on the everyday here in Puerto Rico, it just filters through without me really intending for it sometimes.
Yeah, I mean that leads really nicely to another question I have, which is about, I guess we could call it the ambivalence of place, or maybe the liminal spaces is a better way of putting it, because in that one of the poems you just read, one line reads, "Returning, returning, will die on the airport runway." I mean, it's such an incredible and powerful notion of, well, as soon as you land, um, it's almost as though you've departed already. Can you tell us a little bit about your own relationship with this idea of home and place, and how did you navigate that through these poems?
Mm-hmm. I think there are larger political questions that I had about home, and then more maybe concrete and more personal, which are still political questions, but more personal questions that I was navigating around this topic. And to address the larger ones and then the personal ones, I think I was contemplating, among many things, what does it mean to contend with and love a place under imperial duress? What does it mean for home to be a site of ongoing crisis and political disaster as part of a concerted neocolonial project, right? What does it mean to stay in Puerto Rico? What does it mean to leave Puerto Rico? The complexities and difficulties and wounds around both of those conditions, especially because these are often set up against each other antagonistically, right? And creating problematic rifts between archipelago and diaspora. And then I think also that this question of home and liminality is something I grapple with a lot personally too, because my whole life I've been grappling with the politics of home and belonging, because I'm the daughter of Mexican Jewish immigrants and I was raised in Puerto Rico my whole life. So there's this constant examination and reevaluation of my positionality in relation to Puerto Rico, what it means to not be indigenous, right, to a place or have lineage in Puerto Rico in an occupied and colonized space, and the questions and discomforts and responsibilities around that. But also questions around how do we craft maybe a complex enough understanding of home and belonging that centers indigeneity and longstanding communities, of course, but also takes phenomena such as migration into account, while also not reproducing the violence of the nation state. So it's a whole meal and a whole conversation. But I think these are these are questions that are constantly at the forefront of my consciousness and filter through my writing a little bit.
And I think it's all effortlessly navigated in that writing. I'm just going to go to a comment we have from a viewer, from Tai Fernandez Toledo, who notes that in the summer of 2019, the people of Puerto Rico forced the sitting governor to resign. Yes, that was the reference. That was what you were referencing in that poem. Um, and this was for many reasons, including his cover up of the actual number of deaths from Hurricane Maria in 2017. And I also believe there was a massive leak of
Chats.
really offensive text messages.
Yeah.
Yes. Which actually leads me to another question, which is, to what extent do you see your poems as perhaps almost supplementing the official record that makes it into history? You know, you mentioned all of these, grappling with all of these issues of power and empire and colonialism. Uh, what place do you see your poems as playing within that type of fight back?
Right. I mean, I don't want to project anything onto the book that it may not be doing. But I would like to think, right, or I have the hopes that it's maybe playing into the docu-poetic tradition, initially by interrogating this idea of official histories, right? Like who gets to partake in the curation of these official histories, and who gets seen and who goes unseen. And with that, the dispelling of the myth of objectivity, which has been force fed to us by Western traditions of journalism and the political sciences and so forth, and the political act of reclaiming the act of history writing itself, right, and knocking it off of institutional and hegemonic hands and placing it back where it belongs, in the hands of the people in dispossessed communities, no? And poetry is definitely a medium for that, and I would like to think that uh, my poems are a small part of that very, very big effort, and also potentially an attempt at healing, at mourning and grief, which I think has been how do you say this? I'm thinking of the phrase in Spanish, but necesitan un dragado. They need dredging. It's like a lot of sediment is accumulating in the riverbed of our traumas, and we're not mourning, and mourning isn't happening, right? And so it's an accumulation of these traumas, and there's no release for them. So I hope we manage to enter a stage of collective mourning, and I hope the book allows for that a little bit too.
And it definitely does. I mean, I was just thinking of how in one of your poems, I think it's called Breath, you begin with a very chilling note that states, after Hurricane Maria, many elderly and bedridden people dependent on oxygen concentrators died as a result of extended power outages and or oxygen depletion. Many of these were not included in the official government issued death count.
Right.
Their stories and lives were erased. I mean, that's it's incredible to think of that, and it's really really powerful. I think what you've done in that poem in particular, to kind of return to the fore these histories, these suppressed histories almost.
Mhm.
But on that note, well, I don't know if you read some more of your work for us.
Absolutely, yes. Let me. I'm gonna read two poems. I'll read this poem called Noche de San Juan to start. Noche de San Juan. I left Puerto Rico on a Noche de San Juan. By left, I mean howled out the airplane window, the way sirens and strays put us to sleep each night. Tradition dictates at midnight you must fall back into the sea at least 3 times to ensure good fortune all year. I watched from my window in Luquillo, bags packed as bodies axed through brine, snapping like tree trunks, marveled at the trust in water, in night and falling into it, the belief in magic and some strange providence, how it might conjure up an insurrection, vanish the whole of government, undo the curse of colonialism, plunging 1, 2, 3, 4 times into oncoming waves, a fifth just in case, hoping that harpooning yourself into ocean will change things. This was how I'd last see the island, slicing through the deep, looking to fish out a bottle cap of sustenance, revolt. This was how I'd leave, knowing things wouldn't change, or worse, they would change without me. Everyone fell backwards into the lap of the Atlantic or Caribbean. I boarded an overnight flight, my back shuddering, dry, unblessed by water. And then I'll read one more poem. Um, I am torn between two right now, but I think I am going to go with Forgive Me When I Speak of Land. Forgive me if when I speak of myself, I speak of land. If the mountain of my name, earth falls at the question. If to the question's insistence, my response boards a boat and travels south. If in this traveling south you are disappointed by the distance, my wavering silhouette. If the distance returns me to island, if at island I ask you to dock in the harbor between the first two letters, if in this docking I ask you to look at the eye from overhead, the way you would look at fish, look at how it floats on the white of the page, waterlocked. If the eye waterlocks in the looking, if in the looking I ask if I is not island, if I am not island, if after asking I tell you I'm invoked by the word, the tender lean of the letter into adjacent topography, its intimate shrouding, touching strip of soil. If the intimate conceivement of self is to call upon a history of place, summon the spirit of home. If when I write a poem, every poem I write is home. If when I write this poem, I ask you to forgive me for the earth tumbling out of my mouth.
Wow, thank you so much for that reading.
Thank you.
That poem in particular, Forgive Me If I Speak of Land, really strikes me as a great example of what you do a lot in this book, which is this kind of merger between a personal sort of poetics and almost eco poetics. And,
Mhm.
it's really fitting given the theme of this season of bios and bookmarks and coming after last week's episode with Jason Allen Paysan. Um, I was wondering, to what extent do you see your poems as perhaps a distinctive type of eco poetics?
Mm. It's funny because I was recently having this conversation with my dad about how I really hadn't been thinking about or considering myself as writing under a tradition of eco-poetics, and that I had been getting identified by some people as an environmentalist poet. Not that the two are the same, granted, eco-poetics and environmentalist poetry, but I can definitely say that I do understand myself as writing about the environment and landscape as it relates to the history of and ongoing struggles against colonialism, as it relates to how natural phenomena oftentimes lay themselves out as a symptomatology of pre existing structural violences, as it relates to how disasters are political. And that's a refrain in Puerto Rico that gained a lot of momentum after Hurricane Maria's passing, and as it relates to how landscape is ripe with history and the seedlings of for sovereign futures. So in that sense, I think I understand my work in relation to an eco-poetics of sorts.
Yeah, it reminds you of something the poet John Hewitt once said, through nature, everything else comes. I'm just going to
Mm.
go to there are some more comments from our viewers. We have Fiona is asking, do you want to talk, do you want to talk about your work with the Alasenia and other on the ground activism on the island and the
Oh,
relationship for you between being out among people doing that work and the reflective internal space needed to write?
oh, that's a great question. Oh man, Fiona, you really got me there. And hi. Yeah, for sure. So currently I'm organizing with this beautiful group of feminist, decolonial, trans feminist comrades. We got together during the pandemic, and set up this solidarity pantry at this school that we're occupying and rescuing. And this school was part of the massive school closures that happened in Puerto Rico, while Julia Kelleher,
188.
yep,
Yeah.
while Julia Kelleher was Secretary of Education here, and she was one of the high government officials that was arrested with the whole Rigi Renuncia movement. So there's a lot of background to all of this. But
Did she really end up on your flight?
she did, but this was a flight 4 months afterwards, and I recently been thinking, should I have written a poem or I should have said something to her there, but but she was on my flight, unfortunately. I think she's still facing trials and charges around all of this, but the work that I'm doing with the group is we're rescuing this school that was closed down by the government at that time, and we set up the solidarity pantry for mutual aid exchanges throughout the pantry, and we're sort of getting involved with the community and trying to make the rescue or the occupation of the school a community effort at large, and doing gender violence work within the space as well. And so I guess how the activism or the relationship between that and my work are kind of, I guess, feeding themselves. I'm working on my second collection actually right now, and one of the things it contemplates is political organizing after a return to Puerto Rico after living for 2 years in the States, and sex and sexuality and the politics of disaster. There's a lot going on, but I definitely, one thing I've been seeing this time around is how much my organizing has been trickling into and feeding the poetry that I've been writing in very interesting ways, also in ways that I think I need to make more sustainable, just because I guess with organizing around gender violence comes a lot of violence to the people who are doing the organizing. And so how much are we, or do I want to mine my trauma for the poetry, or how do I take care of myself while at the same time, I guess, exploring these experiences on the page? So I guess those are the things I've been thinking about when it comes to organizing and writing, and I guess, yeah, just the more logistical stuff around making time for that reflective, solitary space needed to I guess transform that, or like make that a part of your work.
I mean,
And
certainly. Yeah, I mean, certainly when you're in the heat of you're in the middle of the action, that can be both very inspirational, but also very difficult logistically to jot down
yeah,
that poem.
yeah.
Which
And also
actually,
being very careful. Oh, sorry.
no, go
No,
ahead,
just
please.
also being very careful also, because this is all collective work, and so how the lives of others come into the work as well, and being very, I think, mindful about that too, right? And how we decide to use those experiences that aren't solely ours, and that are also have a basis on collectivity. So how do we work with them, and how do we, if we decide to, how do we incorporate them into our work in an ethical way, and in an ethical way, and that continues to, I think, center the fact that organizing is reliant on, or at least the way I like to practice it, on a very collective, horizontal, and anonymous almost experience.
Which actually takes us to a comment made by another viewer, I believe, Salima, who says, one of the points, oh, sorry, one of the points you made was such an important point, which was the relationship between art and literature helping us all collectively grieve, which is the backbone to all of our movements. So it's really, really interesting to hear you talk about, this sense of, well, having deference and allowing people ownership of their own stories, but at the same time, there is also a communal value to what you're doing that almost transcends that. Um, I was wondering a bit more about the process of putting together this collection. And,
Mm.
you've mentioned your second collection on the way, and, you've kind of hinted at the differences between being a poet at university, perhaps in the States, and then coming back to Puerto Rico. And I was wondering, one of the things I noticed in this collection was how it's divided into sections. It's structured
Mm.
into sections. Breathing Up Storms is one, Only the Ocean Answers, and so on and so forth. How, can you tell us about the process of devising the structure, and how did the book come together as a whole?
Okay. Yeah. Oh my God. I'm also so sorry. It's like getting really hot right now in Puerto Rico. I hope I'm not sweating on screen. But yeah. So putting the manuscript together was a combination of different things, of accounting for the chronological, the thematic, and the conceptual, which led me to divide the book up into different sections, and also trusting in the experiences that birthed the poems in the first place. But I wanted the book to sort of follow the chronological arc of the events and markers it hinges upon, but I also wanted there to be some room for breath and release and nonlinearity, because these events and markers are heavy with grief and trauma,
Mhm.
and because also history and life don't happen linearly. But in a way, also a lot of the book structure also sort of laid itself out on its own, because I was writing alongside Puerto Rico's political crises, kind of like a journalist following their beat in a way. So when it came time to curate and sit down with the poems as a larger whole, there was also already a sort of underlying organic order or structure insinuating itself, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of like what the process looked like.
And are you currently preparing a Spanish language edition of this same book?
I am. We are. I'm in collaboration with La Impresora, which is a local independent and grassroots press in Puerto Rico that does artisanal and handbound books and works with a risograph machine. And we have finished or almost finished revising and editing the Spanish translation and edition of the book. And we're almost ready to like design it and bring it out into the world. So that's really exciting.
Have you noticed? I mean, is there anything that you've noticed that has been different in terms of like dealing with the Spanish versus the English version?
Oh my God, so many things. And actually, a number of these poems were written in Spanish initially, too, or and it's something that I noticed a lot happening towards the end of my time in the MFA program. They were kind of writing themselves in both languages at the same time and kind of meeting at the middle in a strange way. And so sometimes there were poems I wasn't sure which one was the original and which one was the translation, or because both languages were at play at the time. And so that was interesting. But during the process of like editing and translating the entire body of the work though into Spanish, um it's definitely something that I've loved about it is it's taken on a life of its own. um it's not just a translation of the book in English, it's a whole book in and of itself. It has a different title. Um, a lot of the poems don't stick to or deviate from maybe a more traditional and literal understanding of like schools of translation, and focus more maybe on picking up either the essence of the original or doing the poem justice in whatever ways it needs in Spanish, and to also fit the cultural context of the language, because with the language comes a whole world, a whole cultural world with it. And so that's been interesting to watch, and also going back to the English, noticing stuff in Spanish in the Spanish edition that I had not noticed in the poems in English, and so going back to revise in English after revisions in Spanish from things that I had not noticed or had not paid attention to when I was reading them in English.
I mean, that's one of the advantages of being your own translator. I guess you get to
Yeah.
you're really steeped in all of these nuances, because it can
Yeah.
be, it can, as you say, the translated thing can be its own credo, and of course there's a whole theory of what exactly is translation. Does it even exist? Um, well, that actually brings me to a question about something very specific in the book that I was interested in from a technical point of view, and it was, you have the opening poems are very much rooted in a specific terrain in Puerto Rico, and but then there's a journey that takes place, and I noticed after the certainly after the second section in the book, your lines are literally slashed with slashes, as though I felt as though in my reading that it was a kind of a splitting of self, or fracturing of self, or perhaps an opening up of self into multiplicities. And I was just curious as to, well, what was your what were you thinking with your use of slashes?
Also, I quickly want to say before I answer that, I really appreciate and have been loving listening to your readings of the poems and of the book. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, there's definitely a departure in the terrain in the most literal sense of the word, a leave taking from home, from Puerto Rico to the United States right after the historic and traumatizing phenomenon that was Hurricane Maria. And yes, there is a use at times of line fractures with forward slashes, which, I mean, I think at the time I was trying to do different things with that. One, an attempt at evoking the pauses and play with breath and movement that line breaks and caesuras tend to implement without having to recur to a new line per se. And what that does for a poem visually and horizontally across a page. And also an experiment at pacing out rhythm without having to recur to traditional punctuation to mediate that. And finally, I think also there's a level of fracture in the voice, which you brought up, of deep melancholy and grief that is also trying to make itself known. So,
Right. I mean, thank you so much for that answer. I thought it was very effective, and it was very moving actually.
thank you.
And I just wanted to finally ask you about, can you tell us about some of your influences? Because a lot of these poems are either dedicated to or which inspired by specific poets. Can you tell us about the tradition? What tradition do you see yourself falling within in terms of that?
Yeah, for sure. Many. They've been expansive and so nourishing. I started writing this book in 2017. And at the time, I was reading a lot of poetry and literature from the Anglophone Caribbean, which was such a formative time for me because in Puerto Rico, when it comes to engaging with the Caribbean as a region, there really isn't a strong or established tradition of reading folks outside of the Spanish speaking Caribbean. I mean, the colonial grip has been so strong and effective that, at least when it comes to enforced curriculums and sorts, we barely read ourselves, even Puerto Rican writers, right? Except for the curated canon of Puerto Rican literature, which mostly elevates a white, elite, cishet male body of work, pushing a reductive, racist, and homogenizing cultural nationalism. And so to come into the knowledge of a whole body of work and literary tradition by writers of the Anglophone Caribbean and the Francophone and Dutch speaking Caribbean as well, and to find resonances and parallels across sentiments and images and political thought, it was so enriching and continues to be a learning experience. And I've also been reading poets and writers from the Pacific, and just engaging with their understanding of the condition of being island, their own histories of colonialism, and again the parallels between us as regions and the possibilities of decolonial transnational solidarities, which have been cooking across our diasporic communities for a while, and poets of revolutionary traditions from South Asia and the Middle East, occupied territories such as Palestine and until recently Afghanistan, and places with long colonial histories like India and Pakistan. Mostly, I think right now for the unbridled and exquisite ways that politics and sentimentality are reconciled, especially, and qualities which during my these being qualities that during my time in the MFA program I found were generally disliked by many factions in the United States. So these I think have been my influences throughout the years, and people that I have been looking to and traditions that I have been looking to.
It's really, really, really striking to hear all of these parallels as well that you're discovering between all of these different traditions. And of course, many of us in the Caribbean will recognize some of the same, the English speaking Caribbean will recognize some of the same issues that you're grappling with right now. Um,
Absolutely.
well, I've been enjoying this conversation, but it's
Same.
time. It's time for
Oh man.
our. There's a regular installment here at Bios of Bookmarks where we try to end with a game, a light game, and it's called Promptly Written. And the premise is that you've gotten into an elevator in which the publisher and editor of your dreams just so happen to be there discussing, what are they going to do with their next project, and you would seemingly have a chance to pitch to them any idea, any dream project that you want. And your prompt or theme is going to be derecho de nacimiento or birthright.
Okay. This is an interesting one. For some reason, when I immediately read it, Derecho de Nacimiento, and I don't, this might be a huge cognitive leap that I'm taking right now, but what immediately came to my head have been the recent pro-choice protests that have been happening here in Puerto Rico. There's a very big feminist pro-choice movement because we have a lot of fundamentalists right now in government, and they are passing a lot of public policy around limiting access to abortion rights, especially to minors, and a lot of stuff. And I immediately thought of the green handkerchief that is symbolic and that people use here. So I know that's not what derecho de nacimiento or birthright means, but derecho de nacimiento, the right of, I don't know why I drew that connection to that, and it made me think maybe the right to birth and also the right to people's bodies, therefore, and the right to choose. And I immediately went to that. So I would maybe pitch. Oh man, I would maybe pitch some maybe theater performance or a poetic performance where everybody is wearing the green scarves and they play a central role in the performance, and it's a collective poem being read. Oh man, this is like, I'm really, really pulling this one out of my pocket right now.
I am already signed up
There
for
is
it, by the way. I am already on board.
a symbolic strangling of all of the structural violences with the green handkerchief that do
I think
not let us access our right to choose.
I think bodily sovereignty is certainly inherent to this notion of our own birthrights.
Yep.
So thank you so much for that really mesmerizing, actually, idea.
An action, an
And
action.
action. I don't know if you could indulge us with. We just have a few more minutes left, and I was wondering if you could perhaps, to close the program, read for us one last poem.
Sure.
Um,
Um, I mean, I would also. Is there a particular poem from the book that you read that you would
yes,
like me to
I'm
read?
so glad you've asked me this because I had like a list in the
Oh,
hope
please
that
tell me.
one of the things I always hope whenever I do one of these things is that the writer is going to be like, Andre, which poem do you
Oh,
want me to
please,
read?
yes, to close out this session. Please, please.
But I would like you to read Breath.
Okay, yes. Okay, here we go. Breath. And I'll read the epigraph again. After Hurricane Maria, many elderly and bedridden people dependent on oxygen concentrators died as a result of extended power outages and or oxygen depletion. Many of these were not included in the official government-issued death count. Their stories and lives were erased. All I can think of is the wind and how I want it inside me, rolled up in a tobacco leaf, long drag, a smoldering cigar of air filling my lungs, struggle to rise like unleavened loaves, gasping for the tempest outside, the stillness in my chest, a field of burnt sugar cane. I watch the light bulb above me, wonder how light flees glass without shattering. I hear thrashing beyond the sealed window, whirs of wasted gusts, lace my fingers into holy patchwork, pray the wind finds its way in to think my body capable of collapse beneath skies toppling. I clutch at my breath, turn gray, turn ghost, turn gone, turn the switch on for the love of God, turn on. Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to Andre and Shivani for having me on. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Anna, for that poem and for this wonderful conversation.
Likewise, thank you. Thank you for all of the beautiful questions and the beautiful readings of my book and the poems. It's really, really humbling.
And congratulations on your forthcoming
Thank
publications.
you.
So, from all of us here, thank you to viewers as well for tuning in. And from all of us here at the NGC Bocas List Fest Bios and Bookmarks, goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.